He zipped the duffel bag without looking at me. The kettle was still whistling behind him. Steam curled above my chipped mug, the one my mom gave me after her surgery. And he said it like reading off a receipt. "You're broken now. I didn't sign up for this." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We'll get through this." Just that. And the door clicked shut behind him before I could stand. Not that I could stand. I was still bleeding. The bedroom smelled like antiseptic and old roses. There were pads in the trash and hospital socks on the floor. My ultrasound photo, creased, thumb worn, still clung to the fridge with a magnet from Lake Tahoe. The tiny sage, green onesie I bought last month lay untouched in its bag. He didn't take anything that belonged to the baby. He didn't even ask. I kept replaying his words. Broken. Like I was defective. Unfixable. A thing. Something to discard when it got inconvenient. 7 years together, and that was the line he drew. Not the hard days. Not the money stress. Not the nights I rubbed his back through anxiety or filled out job applications for him while nursing a fever. But this. My body failed, and I became disposable. I stood in the doorway, arms shaking. Not from grief. Grief came later. This was something else. Something cold. Sharp. I wasn't broken. I had been cracked open. And the part of me that always stayed silent. She was waking up. Would you fight back or let someone erase you like that? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever made you feel disposable when you needed them most? Share your story below. You're not alone. I used to wake before the sun, not because I had to. Our apartment was barely 15 minutes from the dental clinic. But because I liked the quiet. The sound of the coffee machine dripping, the slow bloom of light through the blinds. Matt usually slept in. On those mornings I'd sit at our kitchen table. Barefoot, hair unbrushed, a chipped mug of hazelnut coffee in hand, and I'd feel lucky. Not overwhelmed or ecstatic. Just lucky. That kind of soft gratitude you whisper to yourself so you don't jinx it. That was before everything. Before I realized luck has nothing to do with being loved or left. Matt and I met at a tax seminar. Not exactly the stuff of romance novels. He was funny, polished, charming. He leaned over during a dull PowerPoint and whispered, "If you fall asleep, I'll fake a coughing fit to cover your snore." We were married 11 months later. He said he wanted a partner, someone calm, steady, real. I didn't realize then that real meant low maintenance. He was in and out of different sales jobs over the years, mattresses, solar panels, timeshares. He never stayed long. Always said his talents were bigger than a paycheck. I believed him. I worked full-time, kept our fridge stocked, our laundry folded, our bills paid. He brought me iced tea on Saturdays and kissed my forehead at the grocery store. People said we looked solid. Stable, like we had it figured out. But when the doors closed, he shut off too. It started with silence, then shrugs. Then, one night, as I laid a lasagna on the table, he said, "You always act like everything's fine. It's exhausting." I stared at the casserole, steam curling into my face. I hadn't said a word. I made myself smaller over time. Didn't complain. Didn't ask about the bounced checks or the 300 coaching workshop on his credit card. I figured he'd find himself eventually, and when I turned 40, I thought maybe this was it. The beginning of something new. Something soft, something that would make us us again. I remember the test, that little pink plus sign. My hands shook, but my heart soared. He found me in the bathroom, still holding it. "You're pregnant." I nodded. He blinked. "Wow," he said, voice flat. "Timing's interesting." Then he grabbed his car keys and left for the gym. He didn't even touch me. Still, I held on. I told myself he was overwhelmed, that men don't always process things the same way. That he'd come around. I cleared out the guest room. Painted the walls a soft sage green, ordered a glider chair and stared at tiny socks online. I had names written in a journal. No one knew. Not even him. Just me and the baby. I brought home prenatal vitamins and lined them next to the salt shaker. He never asked about them. Never moved them. Never noticed when I cried after appointments. By the time I hit 10 weeks, I stopped sharing updates. At 12, I had my first ultrasound. I printed 2 copies, one for me, one for him. He left it in the car for 3 days until I retrieved it. Wrinkled, stained by spilled coffee. He never asked how the appointment went. On Sundays, I'd sit in the nursery with the lamp on, reading parenting articles. He'd be out with his networking group. Sometimes he came back with the smell of whiskey and someone else's perfume. Still, I didn't confront him. Still, I believed love was something you worked through, not ran from. My best friend Lydia asked me once, "Ratch, does he even want this baby?" I laughed too quickly, said, "He's just scared. He'll be fine once he hears the heartbeat." But the truth was, I had started to prepare for being a mother alone. The only person who seemed excited, truly, wholeheartedly, was me. One Friday night, I made chicken marsala from scratch. It used to be his favorite. He walked in, glanced at the set table, and asked, "Is this supposed to make up for something?" I said nothing. He ate 2 bites, scrolled through his phone, then went to bed. I sat in the kitchen that night, the windows fogged, the house too still. And for the first time, I thought, this might not be temporary. The only touch he gave me during the pregnancy was when he passed the remote. No belly rubs, no nighttime whispers to our child. No names brainstormed, no crib assembly. The day before the miscarriage, I had gone to Target alone. I bought baby washcloths and a nightlight shaped like a moon. I remember checking out and the cashier smiling. "You nesting?" she asked. I smiled back, nodded, said, "Yes." Like I had a partner, a plan, like my life was still whole. The receipt crinkled in my purse. It's still in there. I haven't touched it since, because the next day, there was blood, pain, a cold tile floor, and silence. Matt didn't pick up when I called. When he finally texted back, hours later, he wrote, "Don't fall apart. We move on." That was it. 7 years. One sentence. And now, even days later, I could still hear it. Louder than any apology he never said. Sharper than any insult he never had to speak. That sentence told me everything. I wasn't broken. He was never whole. The smell of bleach still makes my stomach turn, even now. Even after everything. Because that morning, I woke up on the cold tile of our bathroom floor, knees scraped, nightshirt soaked, and the world completely silent. There was blood, everywhere. In my socks. Under my fingernails. Across the pale bath mat that used to have little embroidered seashells. The kind of silence that comes only when something ends. I reached for the phone on the counter, fingers trembling, mind half frozen. My legs wouldn't move right. There was a pain deep in my spine. A twisting, dull ache like something had torn loose. The last thing I remember before everything faded was the sound of the faucet dripping. That, and my own voice. Choked. Weak. Trying to say his name. When I came to, a nurse was patting my wrist, calling out, "Rachel. Rachel, you're okay. You're safe." But I wasn't. Not really. They wheeled me into a recovery room. Dim lights, soft beeping. Plastic curtain pulled halfway closed. The hospital gown was stiff. My arms ached from the IV. The sheets were too white. Too clean. No one was in the chair beside my bed. I reached for my phone. 2 missed calls, my OB and my clinic. Nothing from Matt. I texted him anyway. "I lost the baby. 10 minutes. Nothing." I texted again. "Please come." 30 more minutes. Still nothing. Finally, just past noon, a reply, "Don't fall apart. We move on." That was all. No. "Are you okay?" No. "I'm on my way." No heart. No name. Just instructions. Like I was a machine he'd given up on fixing. I stared at that message so long the screen dimmed. The nurse came back with water. She thought I was crying because of the loss. I didn't correct her. I asked if someone could bring me clean clothes. She said she'd check. I asked if I could go home that night. She said I shouldn't be alone. I didn't have the heart to tell her. I already was. When I was discharged, I sat on the edge of the bed with the discharge papers in my lap. No one to wheel me out. No one to help me button my coat. My OB, Dr. Paddle, knelt in front of me. "Rachel," she said gently, "do you have someone at home with you?" I nodded. though I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to believe it. Maybe I just didn't want pity. My Uber driver was a middle-aged woman named Jeanette. She offered me a tissue as I slid into the back seat. "Been there," she said softly. "I'm so sorry." I didn't cry. I just looked out the window as the hospital disappeared behind us. The sun felt too bright, the sky too blue. Like the world didn't know what it had taken from me. The apartment smelled like dust and lemon cleaner. The lights were off. Matt wasn't home. I sat on the couch, held my stomach out of habit. It felt empty. Like a house after a moving truck. No trace of what used to live there. The nursery door was still cracked open. I closed it, slowly, quietly. Like not waking something that might still be sleeping. Later that night he came home, tossed his keys on the counter. "Feeling better?" he asked, like I'd had a cold. I said nothing. He took off his shoes, opened the fridge, poured himself a drink. "Wes, we don't need all that baby stuff now, huh?" He sipped his whiskey. Didn't look at me. I walked into the bathroom. Shut the door. Locked it. The bath mat was gone. I had thrown it away. But I could still see the stain. The rest of that week blurred. Friends texted. I didn't reply. Lydia left a voicemail. "Call me. Please. I'm here." I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to explain a loss I hadn't finished feeling. Matt kept living like nothing had changed. He watched sports. Went to lunch with his brother. Slept soundly beside me. Sometimes he'd glance at me and mutter, "You've got to get past this. It happens. It happens. Like bad weather. Like a parking ticket. Like a stain on your shirt." He didn't hold me. Didn't ask. Didn't notice when I sat in the dark for hours. Didn't care when I stopped eating full meals. And then, one night, I opened our joint bank account out of habit. Something felt off. 3 unfamiliar charges: a $289 at a golf shop. Liter 122 dinner for 2 at a steakhouse I'd never heard of. Lute 89 for a spa gift card. All in the last 48 hours. My name was on that card. So was his. But the money? That was my paycheck. I had been covering everything for weeks. I stared at the transaction list, and something cold settled in my chest. It wasn't just that he was spending. It was that he was celebrating. Living. While I was surviving. While I was still bleeding. I clicked open a spreadsheet. Typed in the date, the amount, what he bought. Then I opened a folder. Titled it, Receipts. It was the first time in days my fingers felt steady. The first time I'd exhaled fully since the hospital. Something inside me had shifted. Not rage, not revenge, but resolve. The kind of quiet, bone-deep knowing that comes when you realize you've been the only adult in the room for far too long. And now I was done playing nice. The spa gift card arrived in the mail 3 days later. It was addressed to Matt. But the return address, it belonged to a woman named Haley. No last name. Just neat cursive handwriting on a lilac envelope, sealed with a heart-shaped sticker. I held it in my hand for a full minute. The edge of the paper dug into my thumb. There was no note inside. Just the card, already activated. 100 for a couples massage. Booked the day after I came home from the hospital. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just opened my laptop, clicked open the folder I'd labeled Receipts, and added a photo of the envelope. That night, I waited. Not to pick a fight. I was past hoping for a confession. I just wanted to see what a coward looked like up close. Matt came in around 9:15. Hair gelled, new button-down shirt. Smelled like cologne I didn't recognize. He tossed his keys on the counter, grabbed a beer from the fridge. "You eat already?" he asked. I didn't answer. He sat on the couch, shoes still on, and turned on the TV. I stood in the doorway. The envelope in my hand. "I opened your mail." My voice was flat. He didn't turn around. "Okay." It was a gift card. From someone named Haley. Still no reaction. Just a sip of beer. Eyes on the game. I stepped closer. "You booked it the day after I lost the baby." He finally looked at me. Expression blank. "Is this about money again?" I blinked. "What?" He stood up, walked right past me. "You always make everything so dramatic." I followed him into the kitchen. "It's not about money," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's about respect. He opened the fridge again. Still not looking at me. You're always upset. Always needing something. He pulled out a bottle of ranch dressing, stared at it, then set it back. You cheated on me. There, I said it. He turned, finally. Face hard. You don't know what you're talking about. I stepped forward. I know the charges. I know the restaurant. I know the card was delivered here. He scoffed. Maybe if you hadn't been so obsessed with the baby, we'd still be okay. My mouth went dry. Obsessed. I repeated. You shut me out, he said, as if that settled it. You made everything about you. I stared at him. I had a miscarriage. He shrugged. And I still had to come home to your face like a funeral every night. Silence. I could hear the dishwasher ticking softly behind me. A faint breeze moved the curtains by the kitchen window. Something cracked. Not in the room. Inside me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was done. Are you leaving me? I asked. Calm. Like I was asking if he needed the car tomorrow. He looked at me for a long second. Then gave a lazy half nod. I've been thinking about it. Since when? He didn't answer. Before or after I got pregnant? I pressed. Still nothing. I nodded to myself, took a breath, and walked to the bedroom. I pulled out a small duffel bag from under the bed. Mine, not his. Started folding the maternity clothes I hadn't worn yet. The ones with tags still on. He followed me to the doorway, leaning on the frame, arms crossed. What are you doing? Packing up the things that still belong to me. I said without looking up. He snorted. Bit dramatic, don't you think? I zipped the bag shut, turned around slowly. You know what's dramatic? I said. Walking out on your wife after she loses your child and calling her broken. He opened his mouth to reply. But I walked past him before he could. I went to the closet, pulled down the box where I kept my old financial files, pay stubs, bank statements, my old tax returns, a copy of the car title, with my name only. His eyes followed me. What's all that? He asked. I smiled. Soft, but not kind. You'll find out. He laughed, but there was an edge of panic. You think you can play hardball now? No. I said, stacking papers into a new folder. I think I've been playing fair for too long. He stepped forward. Don't forget, I know things about you too. I looked up. Like what? That I paid the rent for 2 years straight. I took a step closer. That I covered your insurance, your gym, your stupid coaching app. His face tightened. I handed him the spa gift card. Give this to Haley, I said. She might still think you're worth it. He dropped it on the floor. I should have left months ago. I nodded. You should have. But you didn't. And now it's my turn. He turned away. I'm not playing this game. I whispered. But I am. That night, I changed the passwords to every account I still had control over, unlinked his name from my checking, called my HR department to switch direct deposit to a new account, and canceled the joint card. The next morning, he called me 4 times, then once from a blocked number. I didn't answer. By noon, he came home. You changed everything, he demanded. I stood by the window, folding laundry. You told me I was broken, I said. And I believed you. For about 5 minutes, he clenched his jaw. You're acting like a child. No, I said. I'm acting like a woman who finally woke up. He tried to argue, but the lights flickered. He hadn't paid the electric bill. Because he assumed I always would. I handed him an envelope. Inside, a list of charges I had already documented. Printouts, voicemails, dates. He flipped through it. His face slowly fell. You're serious, he said. I am, I replied. And that was the first night he didn't sleep in our bed. Not because I kicked him out, but because he couldn't face me anymore. He left 3 mornings later. Didn't say goodbye. Took his golf clubs. Left his mail. And I stood at the window watching his car pull away, heart silent, face still. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. Because I finally understood. Some endings don't need permission. The first morning after he left, the silence felt like a stranger. Not peaceful. Not freeing. Just hollow. the kind that makes your ears ring, that creeps into your bones and stays there. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug my mother gave me the year she started chemo. It had tiny blue flowers on it, worn now, chipped near the rim. She used to say, "Strong tea, steady hands." Mine were still trembling. I had boiled water, dropped in the same ginger tea bag I'd bought during the pregnancy. It tasted like shame now. Like failure. Like goodbye. The apartment looked different in daylight. His shoes weren't by the door. The worn spot on the couch cushion, his spot, was still indented, but empty. I had left the curtains open. Light streamed in, catching the dust in the air like glitter suspended in slow motion. Everything looked clearer. Too clear. The nursery door remained closed. I hadn't opened it since that night. Since I stood outside it, bleeding into my pajama pants, begging a man who didn't come. I looked down at my tea, lukewarm and untouched, and I asked the question I had been avoiding for days. Was it all my fault? Not just the miscarriage, but everything? Had I chosen wrong, stayed too long, given too much to someone who gave so little? I thought about the years. The birthdays I planned. The apartment I made into a home. The dinners reheated when he came home late, without explanation. I thought about the time he lost his job, and I sold my grandmother's necklace to cover rent. He never even asked where the money came from. I took a sip. The tea had gone bitter. I stood, walked to the sink, and poured it out. That's when I saw it. A notification from our old joint bank app still logged in on my phone. He had tried to use the cancelled card, the 78.43, rejected at a gas station 30 miles out. I stared at the screen. He had left, but not before trying to use what didn't belong to him. The tears didn't come. Not then. Not even when I sat back down and opened the folder I'd labeled receipts. Because now it wasn't just a collection. It was a case. I printed everything, cross-referenced statements, marked dates on a calendar. The voicemail he left 2 days after leaving played in the background. "You're blowing this out of proportion. We weren't working anyway." Then, quieter. "You'll see. I'll land on my feet." I paused the message. Rewound. Listened again. That tone, smug, flippant, so sure he'd still come out ahead. I took out my pen and underlined the date. The apartment felt warmer now, not because of the weather, but because I was finally seeing everything for what it was. This wasn't grief. Not anymore. This was clarity. There were things I still couldn't bring myself to do. Open the nursery door, touch the ultrasound, delete the baby name list in my notes app. But there were things I could do. I could call Janice. I could make a list. I could trace every step of what he owed, what I gave, and what I was ready to take back, because he hadn't just taken money. He had taken time, energy, peace, and now I wanted it back. I went to the bedroom, pulled out my old laptop from before we married, the one I used to freelance with, before he asked me to focus more on home. It still worked. The wallpaper was still my mother's favorite quote. "A woman doesn't break. She recalibrates." I stared at it. Let it sink in, felt my breath catch, not from pain this time, but from remembering who I used to be. Not broken, just delayed. The next morning I made real coffee, scrambled eggs, tossed the maternity vitamins into the trash, and took a long shower, letting the water run hot until the mirror fogged and the scent of rosemary filled the air. It didn't fix anything, but it felt like a beginning. That afternoon, I made one call. "Janice." My voice was steady. "It's time. I want to talk options." She didn't ask what happened. She knew. She'd been waiting. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said. "Bring everything you have." I looked at the folder on my table. Neatly labeled. Stacked. Organized. Receipts, not just numbers. Proof that I wasn't crazy. That I hadn't imagined it. That the woman I had been, the one who kept waiting, kept forgiving, kept hoping, was finally off the clock. Janice arrived just after 10 a.m., wearing jeans, a gray blazer, and that sharp expression she always wore when she meant business. She carried a yellow legal pad and a canvas tote that said, "Trust me, I've read the fine print." We hadn't seen each other in almost a year. Not since her second divorce. We hugged, brief, warm, not too much. Then she looked at the folder on my kitchen table. This everything? I nodded. Receipts, statements, voicemails, screenshots. She flipped through them without speaking, lips pressed tight. The light from the window hit the side of her face, and I could see the same shift in her eyes that had happened to mine 2 weeks earlier. This wasn't just marital fallout. It was a pattern. Emotional neglect, financial abuse, disappearing acts layered with credit card bills. Matt hadn't left a marriage. He had abandoned responsibility. Janice looked up. You've got a case. I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Nevada law doesn't like asset fraud, she continued, especially when one spouse ghosts and leaves the other with medical debt, rent, and a history of covering everything. She tapped the paper. These are dates. This is evidence. This is work. We spent 2 hours sorting. She made columns. I added notes. We listened to his voicemails again. The one where he said, "You'll regret this," and the one where he laughed about being free again. I need access to your joint accounts, she said. I already separated my direct deposit. Everything else is still open. Good. Don't touch anything else. Let him keep slipping. She looked up. If he charges anything new, it strengthens your case. That night, I sat alone at the dining table, the laptop open. I pulled up the banking app. 2 new charges. One 4710 bar and Sparks 1399 hotel reservation in Lake Tahoe. He was celebrating again, and I was documenting every line of it. I opened a new spreadsheet tab. Color-coded the entries. Yellow for charges under 100. Red for anything over 250. I wasn't angry anymore. I was efficient. Each click felt like a breadcrumb laid for justice to follow. The next morning, I picked up a small filing cabinet from a thrift store, painted it sage green, the same color I once painted the nursery. The color I had attached to hope. Now it belonged to power. I filed every receipt, every email, every note from Janice. Each drawer had a label. Ubiangcrditx, voicmails, legacy. I didn't know why I chose that last word. Maybe because I needed to believe something would survive all this. Something of me. That week, I also changed the locks. Not out of fear, but because I could. He hadn't come back. But I wouldn't give him the chance. I boxed up the last of his things, left them on the porch. Texted, "You have 48 hours. After that, they're gone." He replied with a thumbs up. As if this was a group chat. As if this wasn't the wreckage of a life we once built together. Janice filed the first formal petition on a Friday. We were claiming reimbursement for medical bills, a misuse of joint accounts, emotional distress, asset abandonment. There was a knock at my door that evening. A manila envelope slipped through. Inside, a letter from Matt's lawyer, asking for amicable resolution. No apology. No explanation. Just a veiled attempt to shut it all down. I handed it to Janice. She laughed, short and bitter. "He's scared." "Should I feel anything?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. You've already felt enough." That weekend, I took a walk around Virginia Lake. It was cold. The kind of November chill that turns your breath visible. I wore my mother's scarf, held my coffee close, and let myself feel the weight of it all, just for one loop. And then I went home. Updated the spreadsheet. Made soup. Watched reruns of old cooking shows. Didn't cry, because the woman who used to cry was gone. And the one who replaced her, she had better things to do. I was rebuilding. Not just my life, but my self-respect. And no one gets to invoice you for that. Have you ever had to rebuild something in silence, piece by piece, line by line? Tell me where your strength came from. I'd love to hear your story below. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of quiet justice and healing after 40. I labeled the last folder, Trial Prep Phase 1. It sat in the center of my dining table. The sage green cabinet behind it looked almost decorative, but every drawer held a timeline Matt couldn't erase. Janice called every other day now, not because she needed to, because she knew I was ready. "Next week, we file discovery," she said on Tuesday. "He has no idea what's coming." I nodded. watching steam curl up from my coffee. I hope he shows up with that same smirk. He will, she replied. But it won't last long. That night, I stayed up late reviewing statements. Not because I doubted my memory, but because reading it all again reminded me how far I had come. With the frozen $200 charge to a hotel in Palm Springs, the Venmo payments labeled Jim and Consult that were clearly not. The restaurant bills for two, always after midnight. Each one layered a story, each one was a fingerprint. Matt hadn't just left, he looted, and now he was about to learn that everything he touched left a trail. Janice sent over a draft of our legal motion: spousal abandonment, placet exploitation, false medical negligence exposure. 3 pages of clear, sharp, state-backed reality. I read every word, twice. We compiled affidavits, emails, voicemails. Even Lydia submitted a written statement that she had witnessed Matt ignore my condition, that he mocked me behind my back, that he once told her she can't even carry a baby, but wants to carry this marriage. I stared at that quote for a long time. It didn't sting anymore. It confirmed what I already knew: his love had terms. By Friday, Janice submitted our formal complaint. It was civil court. But it meant something real. It meant he had to answer. On paper, with consequences. The summons went out Monday morning. Hand-delivered, he signed for it. I saw the timestamp. 10:32 a.m. at 11:07. He texted, "You really want to do this?" I didn't reply. Janice said not to. At 1:45, another text. "You'll regret dragging this out. Just let it go." I screenshotted it, added it to the file labeled ENTMDNIOINDRCT. That evening I sat on my porch, sweater wrapped around me, mug in hand. My neighborhood was quiet. Leaves rustling across the pavement. Sunlight gold against the rooftops. I hadn't felt this calm in years. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't fury. It was justice, the slow, deliberate kind. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. I didn't tell anyone outside Janice and Lydia, not because I was hiding, but because I didn't need applause. This was personal, private, precise. The next day, I updated my binder, added printed photos, the hotel confirmations. A screenshot of his dating app profile Lydia found, with a parking receipt from the day he told me he was at. Interview. Proof. Pattern. Presence. Janice texted, "He's panicking. His lawyer just requested an extension." I replied, "Let him sweat. I've waited longer for less." We drafted a timeline for hearing. Early spring. 3 months. Enough time to solidify everything. In the meantime, I filed a motion to freeze the last remaining joint account. His lawyer protested. The judge approved it. Matt overdrafted within 2 days, and that's when the calls started. Blocked numbers. Fake names. Voicemails pretending to be civil. "Can't we settle this like adults? We don't need court, just talk to me." I didn't, because I'd already spent years just talking, and nothing changed. Now, the only conversation he'd get from me would come stamped, notarized, and countersigned. I opened a clean envelope, slipped in the court calendar, addressed it to him. No note, no message, just the facts. It was the first time I had ever sent him something without emotion. That night, I cleaned out the nursery, not in grief, but as closure. I folded the baby clothes, kept 1 pair of socks, donated the rest, put the glider chair on Craigslist, and then I painted the walls, same sage green, but this time for me. A small writing desk by the window, a plant in the corner, framed quote from my mother, "Don't wait to be rescued. Build your own way out." It became my room, my space, my reminder. Matt texted again that weekend. "You'll ruin me." I didn't even open the message, because it wasn't about ruining anyone. It was about restoring what was taken. Quietly, legally, completely. The week before court, Janice called. "He's trying to propose a settlement. He's nervous." "Let him come," I said. "But we don't bargain with cowards." She laughed. "You really have changed." "Not changed," I said. "Returned." Because the version of me who gave, who stretched, who waited, she had her time. But now, it was my turn to write the ending. Would you take the offer, or let justice speak in full? The courtroom was colder than I expected, or maybe that was just my body remembering. The hospital. The silence. The way I had folded into myself and waited for someone, anyone, to show up. Now I was here, hair pulled back, plain navy dress, no makeup but clean lines, steady breath. Janice stood beside me, calm as ever, fingers tapping her folder in a rhythm I recognized. Intentional, measured, unshakable. Matt was already seated when I walked in. He looked smaller, tired. His shirt wrinkled like he hadn't planned ahead. He didn't meet my eyes. His lawyer whispered something into his ear. He nodded but didn't look convinced. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s, silver hair, clear voice. Her presence didn't dominate the room. It anchored it. I liked her instantly. Janice stood first. She began by laying the structure: a brief marriage, followed by financial imbalance, a traumatic medical event, and a complete withdrawal of support from the defendant. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Then came the documents. A bank statements with unexplained charges. A medical bills solely in my name. A voicemails where Matt laughed, blamed, or ignored. Then came the timeline, point by point, moment by moment. I didn't flinch, didn't cry. I watched, listened, absorbed. Matt shifted in his seat, fidgeted, tried not to look at the screen when they projected the financial timeline. Then came the witness statements. Lydia testified with calm strength. She recounted how I hid pain to protect the image of our marriage. How Matt once joked, "At least if she loses the baby, we won't have to change the lease." Gasps in the gallery. The judge raised her hand. No drama. Just control. Then the nurse. She remembered when I came in alone. When I cried through discharge paperwork. When no emergency contact ever showed. The judge leaned forward. Did she seem emotionally supported? The nurse hesitated, then shook her head. No, Your Honor. She seemed abandoned. Matt's lawyer finally stood. His defense. We were drifting apart. That I was emotionally erratic. That I had refused to move on. Janice waited. Let him finish. Then she stood again. Her voice never cracked. Your Honor, this isn't a case of simple heartbreak. This is about a woman left to grieve, heal, and carry the weight of a marriage, while the other party exploited her silence. The judge turned to Matt. Do you dispute the medical bills were unpaid? He stammered. I didn't know. She never told me. Were you aware of her hospitalization? He paused. Then, I got a text. Did you respond? He fidgeted. I said we'd move on. The courtroom held its breath. The judge exhaled. Mr. Lawson, moving on is not the same as showing up. He said nothing. Janice handed over the final piece. A notarized document showing the car, used solely by Matt, was still in my name. He had pawned it 2 weeks earlier. Final straw. The judge read through the materials slowly, deliberate, page by page. Each line sealing something closed. I didn't look at Matt. Not once. Because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about me. And the version of me who had sat in that hospital bed, bruised, alone, and still hoping. I deserved to sit here now still, whole and unshaken. The gavel came down. The rulings: the full reimbursement of all medical expenses, financial compensation for breach of spousal duty, a removal of Matt from any remaining assets, a court fees covered by him. The judge's final words. This court acknowledges the emotional and financial abandonment inflicted upon the plaintiff. Justice is awarded accordingly. No applause. No music. Just the sound of Matt's lawyer packing up fast, and Matt rubbing his eyes like the verdict was a bad dream. I stood, shoulders back. No one helped me out of that room. I didn't need it. Outside, the wind had picked up. Cool, crisp air brushed against my face. I let it. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, I didn't brace myself for impact. Would you call this justice, or is there more to reclaim? I didn't throw a party. There was no champagne, no loud music, no group text saying, "It's finally over." Just silence. And a sense of space I hadn't felt in years. But I did buy myself a new lamp. Brushed gold, Lennon shade. The kind of light that hums instead of shouts. It sat on the corner of a second-hand table. I refinished myself. One leg a little shorter, one corner smoothed from years of someone else's life. But it was mine now. All of it was. 6 weeks after the ruling I moved. Still in Reno. Still close to the clinic. But farther from who I used to be. The new place wasn't big, but it breathed differently. Windows that opened without sticking. A balcony that caught afternoon sun. A kitchen that smelled like possibility. The lease was in my name, no joint account. No co-signer. Just Rachel. That first night, I sat on the floor with a grocery store pizza and a folded blanket. No furniture yet. No TV. Just the soft clink of wind chimes from the neighbor's patio, and my own heartbeat, steady, present. I unpacked the sage green mug my mother gave me after her first chemo session. I set it by the window. It belonged there, next to light. Then I framed a single photo. Not me and Matt, not our wedding, not even the nursery. Just her, my mom, in her garden, straw hat, loft lines. Dirt under her nails. The look of a woman who'd been through fire and come out growing things. Some mornings now, I sit in the quiet again, but this quiet is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of peace. I journal. Not every day. Not obsessively. But when something real needs naming, sometimes I write about the heaviness that still sneaks in at night. About how certain smells, bleach, rubber gloves, lavender, bring me right back to that hospital. How sometimes I hold my breath when opening mail. Still bracing for debt, for blame, for something with his name on it. But I also write about the first meal I cooked for myself just because I wanted it. How I rearranged the spice rack. How I finally threw away the maternity vitamins that expired last spring. Janice says the final paperwork will arrive by mail soon. A thin envelope that means it's over, officially. No more shared property. No more technicalities. No more loopholes for him to crawl through. Last week, I used part of the settlement to pay off my credit card. Then I paid rent 6 months in advance. Then I opened a savings account. Just in my name. I called it Foundation, not Freedom, not You Fund, just a place to start building. Quietly. On my own terms. I also signed up for an evening class. Basic home repair. Lydia said, "You're gonna be unstoppable." Maybe she's right. Because what I've learned, what no one tells you, is that healing doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like breathing without apology, like sleeping through the night without bracing for the morning. Like walking into your own apartment and not flinching at shadows. It's not dramatic. It's daily. It's drinking coffee from your favorite chipped mug and realizing it still holds warmth just fine. It's the moment you change a light bulb yourself and smile because you didn't need to ask. Not even once. I still keep the sage filing cabinet. It sits against the far wall of my bedroom. Not because I need it, but because it reminds me I did that. Every drawer once held evidence. Now only one matters. Drawer 50 inside a copy of the court ruling, a copy of the savings account slip, and a pair of tiny green socks, unworn. Not as grief, not anymore, but as proof that I loved, hoped, carried, and endured, and that I let go without erasing any of it. Matt texted last month. Just once. "Hope you're okay." I didn't respond. Because I was, and I still am. Sometimes people ask if I regret staying so long, if I feel foolish for not seeing it sooner. I tell them, every woman I've ever known had a moment when she silenced herself for someone else's comfort. Some of us just took longer to walk out of the silence. But we do, eventually. And when we do, we don't always come out louder. Sometimes we come out quieter, but stronger, more ours. That's what this story is now. Not about him. Not about what I lost, but about the soft, steady reclaiming of my life, of dignity, of presence, of legacy. No headlines, just a woman, her own name on the lease, a good mug, and a lamp that glows like home. There are still moments when I catch myself turning to say something out loud, a comment about the news, a joke I used to hold back. But the room stays quiet, and I've learned not to mind. Loneliness isn't the same as being alone. Some silences are heavy, others are mine. I planted herbs in pots on the balcony. Basil, thyme, mint. They wilted the first week. I watered too little, then too much. Now they're thriving. Small things come back when you tend to them slowly. I reconnected with myself in mundane ways. Sweeping the floor in the morning. Folding laundry while the kettle boils. Lighting a candle at dusk. Vanilla and cedar. I still have the hospital discharge papers. Tucked in a drawer I rarely open. Not to forget, but because I no longer need them to prove anything. What I carry now isn't weight. It's memory. And that's different. Memory reminds you. Weight tries to own you. Some nights I write one sentence in my journal. I made it through today. Or, the tea tasted warm. Sometimes that's enough. Healing isn't poetic, it's repetitive. And slowly, repetition becomes rhythm. And rhythm becomes life again. This morning I made pancakes. No reason. No occasion. Just because the batter felt good between the whisk and the bowl. Because I wanted the smell of vanilla in the kitchen. I played music. Soft jazz. Something with piano, and danced a little while flipping them. Not perfectly. Not gracefully. But freely. And when I sat down to eat, just me, just the plate, just the sunlight through the blinds. I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for him to say sorry. Not for someone to undo what had already been done. Not for a moment to start over. This was the moment. Already happening. Already mine. That's the thing about closure. It doesn't knock. It doesn't send a warning. It just settles in quietly, one morning like light through the kitchen window. And you don't always notice it. Until you breathe easier. Until you look around and realize nothing is missing. Not anymore. Have you ever rebuilt from silence? Piece by piece. Until it finally felt like yours again. Tell me below. You're not alone. Your story matters here. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of quiet justice, closure, and healing after 40.